Beh, mi viene da ricordare subito che Piero Angela
I would like to mention the fact that Piero Angela is a physics graduate from the University of Turin, so he's coming back home. He has 8 degrees that he has received in various universities the world throughout, but his first one was here at the University of Turin,
della nostra università.
so a graduate from our university.
Vi saluto e mi congratulo con voi perché siete
I would like to welcome you and congratulate you for being here, because there are 450 people outside who are queuing and can't come. Piero Angela and I are very sorry, but unfortunately it's all the space we have. I was hoping to have other classrooms connected, and I would also like to welcome you, all the ones who are in streaming. Yesterday, I met one of the people who was in streaming. I met someone in Avigliana, where I was yesterday, who followed us, and I was able to materialize, so to speak, our virtual audience. Normally 650, today I think many more. Piero Angela has written 40 books. This is the latest, Viaggio nella mente, Traveling Through the Mind. I won't like to say that he's sold more than 3 million copies. You all know that. We have thousands of hours on television. But what I would like to say, that there was a time in his life when the Ministry of Education asked him to be an expert, and he didn't know I was going to say this. Piero Angela suggested many things, but the most unusual one, and also possibly the most interesting and telling one on the dissemination, it's to train. It's not to inform, but to train. And this is typical of his attitude, is to train people putting a small balance or weighing scale on their desk, so the children may learn to see things and that there are quantities. Obviously, there are no weighing scales in our schools, but this means that on television people continue to mix up billions and millions. But this gives you an idea of the fact of Piero Angela's attitude. He's not just a scientific popularizer, but maybe he doesn't like it, but he is a militant philosopher of reason. I think he's slightly annoyed by the word philosopher, but maybe with this definite, he's the last of the members of the Enlightenment. He is the one who in 50 years has tried to give a rational approach to this Italian citizens who don't want to be rational. He has tried to talk about problems knowing them, which is another feature that we don't have. We normally talk about problems, but we don't know them. Problems are known if you measure them, if you weigh them, if you have data on them, as he said, and then at that point you can discuss. But usually that's not the way. He is fighting for this. I don't know if it's a winning or a losing battle. I'm afraid that he hasn't really won it, because the 50 years that he experienced are roughly the same which I experienced. And I must say that the image of science hasn't really improved in these past 50 years. Possibly it's even got worse. In fact, people have been questioning science in irrational, magical ways, which is a bit worrying. The New Age, we know what it is, and it's not a matter of debating it. Piero Angela also acted against this and established CICAP a few years ago. CICAP was admired mainly for the study of paranormal phenomena, but what it is a center of people who are involved in the world of science and who try to question pseudoscience. This is what it does. So you see, putting a weighing scale in the primary school desks and disseminate science, but also, like CICAP does, fight pseudoscience, are three things that go together. These are three things that go together, and I don't know whether Piero Angela agrees with it or not, but he is a militant philosopher of reason. I will stop here, because now we have to talk about brains. Piero Angela asked me to have it as a dialogue, and I'm very pleased to do it as a dialogue. Obviously, mine will be a short question, but he will have long answers. I would like to recall a book of Piero Angela's that was in talking about politics. In this book, he explained that we trust our politicians too much. Even if they were the best, they're not the ones that determine growth and development. It's intelligence. It's the ability to use intelligence and the ability to innovate. This evening, we'll be talking about the organ that is responsible for intelligence. Piero Angela has been studying brains for all his life. Ever since his first television program and his first books, he has been studying the development of the brain from 0 to 3 years. This was then something which led him to develop a lot of his research. Initially, he worked on how the brain develops. So I would like to ask him, how does the brain develop? And what have the recent discoveries told us about this compared to the television program that you did many years ago? Neuroscience has greatly developed in 10, 20 years. There have been many programs. There are now 2 programs in the US and in Europe discussing and developing brains and knowledge. Well, I like to refer to an image. You know that on television you see that famous asteroid that hits dinosaurs, this enormous rock that leaves behind it devastation. This is how 4.5 billion years ago the Earth developed. Stones that were circulating in the cosmos, dust, asteroids, stars that at a certain point arrived or interacted to this ball, which is what we were. These rocks, because basically they were rocks, slowly, over 4.5 billion years, have become brains. The extraordinary thing is that there has been, they were rocks that at a certain point started to think and speak. And if you think about it, it's really extraordinary. And the thing that is very beautiful, and also as an image, is that these rocks are transformed into intelligence, now create some similar wakes, and these are the rockets that are moving and going towards the space the rocks originally came for. So we're sending rockets up, and this is the result of the stones and rocks having hit us 4.5 million years ago. So clearly you need 2 different and parallel answers. Thanks to the history of human beings, we know that the brain becomes increasingly complex if we compare to the first fish that with difficulty come to Earth and then become amphibians, the first reptiles and then mammals, and that slowly there is this primitive being whose brain becomes bigger and bigger. Now, what is often not clearly visualized is the time scale of this transformation. So, and it has been done. I have a book many years ago during which I had represented it in a graph. If you take the January the 1st as the beginning of life on Earth, to give an idea of this very long time of evolution, which has led to have a modern brain. If you take January the 1st as the beginning of life, or say the beginning of life on Earth, of the first cells 4.5 billion years ago, the dinosaurs that seem to be prehistoric, in fact appear mid-December. And modern human beings a few minutes before midnight, and in the last few minutes and last seconds that everything has happened. This is one way of seeing evolution. The other way is also to observe the continuous self-construction that happens within the mother's womb over 9 months. And once again, it's something absolutely extraordinary. There are two cells that meet, an ovum and a sperm, in a rather extraordinary manner, because it's not quite clear who decides where they should enter or not, because normally you see this warrior and the sperm enters the cell, so you would think that he determines the sex of the child. I see it slightly different. I think it is the fortress that at one point opens the door to someone who has some degree of affinity. So it's not the warrior, but it's the fortress that opens the gate. That is to say, I think it's the female that determines the sex, but it's very difficult to understand it. In any case, these two cells in 9 months create a complete person with a brain, with their ability to learn. And this is the most important phase. You were talking about the evolution from 0 to 3 years. Imagine that you are in China, that you don't know a word of Chinese and never had a dictionary, nor anyone who can teach you Mandarin. In a matter of a few years you will learn, or even less. You will learn how to speak Chinese by learning. This is what happens to every one of us, and everything must be learned. And in fact, you must also learn how to see, because when a child is born, they see some things, first a little blurred, and then more and more in focus. But they see, but they don't understand what they're seeing. So you must learn to see, in other words. And this is something, it's as if, very important, it's as if you were seeing a newspaper with a headline in Hungarian. You can see it, but you don't understand it. The same thing happens with the child. And here you have a long road where at the beginning a baby is a billionaire, because the baby has all the potential. It's like a Christmas tree with all the lights on. And then as time goes by, they will use one area rather than another and will specialize. And a lot of the little lights will be turned off. Initially, the child is totipotent, could become anything, and then must specialize and must switch some of the lights off. And slowly this process, this learning process continues, where the role of the mother is essential, or of the person who is closer to the child, because this is the person who will help the child become a citizen and a thinking being. So there is this period which is a sort of structuring of the brain, during which the brain is extremely plastic, learns, and some neurons, there's the famous selection of neurons, but there are more and more connections between and among neurons. There was a very beautiful film by François Truffaut, which described the story, a real story, which had taken place in France in the 1800s, of a child who appeared to be 6 or 7, who had been found in a wood in Aveyron in France, completely wild. He'd been either abandoned or lost or something, and he'd managed to survive, but he walked on 4 legs and hid in warrens and burrows a bit, and when some hunters found him, he was then taken to a center where a teacher tried with education, very difficult, to bring him into the modern world, but failed or only partly succeeded. So it showed that, in fact, most of the lights had been turned off, and this child was never developed. I saw a similar thing that happened in Boston in the 70s of 2 twins that had been abandoned by the mother, who only occasionally went out to feed them, and they were found when they were about 3 or 4. They were unable to walk, speak, or to have relationships, and this is never changed. It means that that's the critical age where there's certain things either happen or they don't happen, and those lights get switched off. And this is typical of human beings, because human beings are the people who have the longest period of education, isn't it? Education, which means to bring out. That's the literal meaning of the word. Yes, for example, in particular, in the 1800s, there were children in orphanages who were left in their, they were white walls, but they were left in their cradles, no stimulation in terms of language, game, participation, or even in visuals sense. And these children were severely impaired later on. I remember that I had carried out a long research for a series of television programs and a book, and this researcher from Harvard was telling me that they had carried out tests, and they saw that some youngsters went to school when they were 6, and they were 3 years behind. They were not ready for a pathway which is the Homo sapiens one, because they'd been damaged. They hadn't been stimulated. It's like a plant. If you don't give them fertilizers or no water, they dry up, and then you lose it. So the enormous importance of these first 3 years of life. So cultural transmission, because this is what has been transmitted to the child, is fundamental in our species. While in most other animals, there is the prevalence of genetic transmission. Yes, this is an interesting thing, because because animals too think or have their type of activity. Even ants they have a very small brain, about 1 cubic millimeter, when they go around, you see these lines, they go on, they have mental maps, which means that they have their skills too. Yes, but it's more in their DNA rather than, it's more automatic, but there is a part which is learning. In fact, don't forget that there's a very interesting experiment that was carried out with ants. You know that ants are predators, and they also cultivate and grow plants, animals. They have a sort of pastureship because they take larvae from other places. Well, there's some ants that when they became predators and brought some larvae that then they enslaved, these ants of another species learn the language, which is a chemical language, a tactile chemical language, and if they meet ants from their species, they fail to recognize them. So that's a cultural recognition. But when you talk about intelligence, when we see animals like chimps that do extraordinary things, dogs, cats, some have tried to understand how similar or different they are from us, from human beings. It's often said that chimpanzee is 98% of its DNA is like human beings. This doesn't mean that 98% of us is like them. It means that there is a genetic affinity due to evolution. But if we go to see the important part of the brain, which is the frontal part, the prefrontal part, in fact, which is the one where we have a convergence of all the information, which is then processed. This is the basis of intelligence and creativity and upper creativity. So in human beings, this part of the prefrontal cortex represents 29% of the brain. In the chimps, not 27 or 26, but 12%. So that's the big difference. In the dog, 7%. And 3.5 for cats. It's difficult to say, because very often we too have spoken about intelligence of cats and dogs. They have very different type of intelligence, but if you go and check the prefrontal cortex, the dog is more intelligent. So let us talk about our cortex and how it develops. So this cortex is all corrugated. We have more cortex than what would fit in our skull. So I think that in this book, Piero Angela tells us that if we were to flatten it out, we would have something which is a bit like a 3-millimeter headscarf. And that's an exceptional thing. It's corrugated because you try to fold it on itself, a sort of origami of cells. Yes, and then if you think that the brain, in fact, by 75% is water. In some people, there's a bit more water. And it has the consistency of, it's like a bit like a jelly. But naturally, it's a great consumer, this brain consumes oxygen above all. It uses up 20% of all the body consumption of oxygen. So 20–25% of the sugars and food. Yes, it's electrical activity of the brain. It's equivalent, at least it was calculated. It's a comparison that you can't really make, but to give you an idea, it corresponds to about a 15–20 watt bulb, like a fridge one, with a cost of about 2 cents a day. So very cheap and very efficient. In fact, when you talk about and you compare computers and brains, for the time being, the computer loses for one reason. That is to say that a computer works on a bidimensional plane, so it requires a large surface, while the brain is three-dimensional, and this multiplies the possibilities of interactions. They're trying to develop in the US, but also in the Genoa Biotechnology Institute, to develop computers that are starting to develop different levels of chips, different layers of chips. But for the time being, Roberto Cingolani, who is the scientific director of Genoa, says that the brain uses 20 watts and the whole human being 100 watts, so about 20%. If we had the same processing ability with computers, we would have a consumption of about Manhattan levels. That is to say, we would have to use the energy that is necessary for the center of New York, which shows how economical we are and how economical nature was. Yes, evolution has developed very functional and cheap, so to speak, systems. That's the evolution. This cortex, with other things which we have no time to talk about, which we will mention, this structure is where you have memory, feeling, emotions, reasons. Can we analyze these contents, please? Memory. Let's start with memory. Memory is thought, because without memory, you haven't got thought. There was a wonderful book. It was called 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and it was a story of a place where people had lost their memory because they said, well, what is this object? I can't remember what is it called, but what is this? This is a cow. What is a cow? A cow is that thing that gives us milk. What is milk? And at that point, you get lost. Memory is formed in a manner that is not fully understood, but we understand the pathway. Through perception, which comes from all the senses of our organism, there is that archaic part in the limbic part, the intermediate part of the brain, which is the one of emotion. They then go through an organelle that's called the hippocampus, which I defined. I know Giorgio Pierstrata. I had said that it was the central parcel distribution office. You decide whether it's important or not. Why? Because it either affects emotions or it doesn't. All the information that we have have to go through emotions. Think of the film that you've best liked in your life. If suddenly you went back or you saw fast forward, what did you see? You'd see things that are linked to emotions, success and failure, school, marks, love, accidents, illness, mourning, travel, all the things that remains retained in your memory, the film of your life, linked to emotions. What happens at this time? Information is filtered through the various levels through the brain, and there is a secretion of chemical substances which leads to the development of branches inside. And in other words, memory is something physical which is formed through the growth, like a tree. There are other leaves, there are other branches, and that's how the brain develops. So at this moment, I am influencing your memory as you are influencing me, because with your questions and the questions that you will give me and with your image, I will be influenced. There's a continuous exchange, and this memory at a certain point positions itself in different places. For example, visual, tactile, smell, they have different areas in the brain where they're deposited, and at a certain point they will be recalled to create what I would call a mental theater, so you will re-see the things that you memorized. And at this point, we have a complete blank. We don't really understand how it happens. While Piero Angela was talking about Gabriel Garcia Marquez and this idea that we have forgotten everything and we don't even know what a cow is or what milk is, I was thinking of the opposite, which Borges tells us when he tells us about El Memorioso, somebody who couldn't forget anything. That was a problem. So how can our minds select and decide what they're going to retain and what they're not going to retain, or what it is going to retain and what it is not going to retain? Because that's the hippocampus. Because if we were to remember everything, we would be just as paralyzed as if we forgot everything. I'll give you an example. Here now you're sitting down. You have feet on the ground, but you don't even realize it. But if I tell you, beware, feel your feet, you suddenly feel your feet and you didn't feel it before. Or you start feeling your back against the back of the chair. There are very many things stimuli that we receive and which our brain does not perceive, or at least do not exceed the awareness threshold. But if the floor were to bounce, then you would immediately realize, or if the back of the chair, because our attention is attracted by movement, and it can be visual, sound. Think of ambulances when they flash their lights. They do it, and there is a variety of signals there. Or for the sound of sirens, or the noise that we heard earlier on. Suddenly, we heard it. If that noise had been continuous right from the beginning, we wouldn't have realized it. It's the variation of sound in the environment. We do not perceive normality, but the interruption of normality. We need a signal that is no longer perceived as a background noise. Well, there were very many other questions, which was very interesting, because what you're saying is very interesting, but I would like to move on to another topic. What is intelligence? This is the $60,000 question. What is creativity? Well, no, I would like to add something to what we were saying before I answer that, because all these memories, and this is very interesting, and then we'll talk about intelligence, but all this memory goes to create thought, because without memory we can't think. We don't know how you recall these memories, but we can ask ourselves questions, and let's start with an example. Imagine a picnic in the countryside, in the mountains. You will have done it, maybe you'll have had one and maybe you had a little fire, and you've, I don't know, had meat, chicken, roast, there's somebody played the guitar, there's some children running about. Well, now imagine that you have this image and you project it on a screen so you can see it. There was so-and-so who had a checkered shirt, another person was playing the guitar, and so on. Then project on another screen the real photo. So memory and the same thing is the same but different. The details are different. There were no trees, or there was something else. There were rocks on the field, but you didn't do it. The gentleman had a striped shirt and not a checked shirt. Why? Because in fact, we recreate an image, a similar image in our memory, but it's not the same. It's similar. And this is the interesting thing. That is to say that memory is not a photograph, and this opens a very important thing on witnesses, because we spoke about this also in the book. Sometimes they're induced, especially in children, and we know there have been trials. Professor Giorgio Strata has been very active in this, to say there are some witnesses that have no value because they've changed in time, and this is due to the influence of those who speak. Because we have this extremely mobile thing. We are the ones who create these images and this memory. Clearly, rarely are you influenced to this point, but it does happen. So what do we store? And how can we recall it? Because in that case, memory is, well, I need to explain something to us. When we're in a television studio, we have a little screen opposite us, and we can see ourselves. The cameraman sees this image, we see it on the VDU, but what happens at a certain point, there is a black cable which disappears and goes up, and there's no image in that cable. They're just impulses, signals that are transferred, and they're then re-transferred and become an image. We're like that. The optical nerve is the cable, and the director is right up at the top, but our image is not electronic. It's the result of impulses. When an image hits the eye, the retina, we know that there are 100 million receptors. Some have red, some blue, green, others have measure the luminous intensity or the intensity of light. And when the cable goes, that is to say the optical nerve, the signals are divided, horizontal, vertical, light contrast, and they become like confetti, and the impulses go everywhere. Because if you're in an environment where you also have temperature, smells, noise, all this has to be pieced together and form the image. So how can you recall it? This is the wonderful thing. We don't really know, but it happens. The idea of those who are carrying out research is there are already some sequences that are already connected. That is to say that there are parameters rather than images, molecules. For instance, when you say dog, well, you visualize a dog. What sort of dog do you visualize? Pekingese? Well, when you say the word dog, you visualize a dog, but how do you visualize it? It's a Pekingese. If you ask a child to draw a dog, they will draw an animal with a long face, with a nose that may be damp, with a tail and legs, with all the variations. But there is the notion of dog. Take a ball, and this is also part of learning how you connect things. What is a ball? Well, to start with, you can say it's round, it's elastic, it's smooth, it's colored, and then as time goes by, all these things pieced together, and you get the notion of ball. This enables our memories to interpret an object that they see, even if you don't know it. For example, if you see in a museum a medieval metal studded mace, you know that how it is used, and the handle, for example, will be part metal and part wood, and you know that the metal part is colder than the wood one, and so on and so forth. Our ability to memorize and interpret through certain experiences, we can then interpret and adapt them to new contents, and that is intelligence. That is to say, to understand what it was, or to understand what you see that you don't know. So intelligence is this, but it's also other things. Don't think that I can. Don't expect me to help you in this. You have to define it. Well, many years ago, I wrote the preface to a book that was very interesting of two a British and an American psychologist who were discussing were comparing acquired and innate intelligence. We all agree that the two things exist. That is to say, you have both the computer and the software. So we are made of nature and environment, nature and nurture. But in what proportion? There's a lot of discussion on this. In any case, other than this, the fact is that if your genes, your machine, because we're all different, we all have different genetic intelligences because we have different things, and different doesn't mean superior or inferior. It means something very interesting. For instance, if you do the famous intelligence tests, this works very well for the people who have a more rational mathematical approach. But if you do to a painter, probably, unquestionably, there are some tests that show that even inventors or painters, they don't get very good results because they're interested in other aspects. The thought is a very complex thing, and it goes in different ways. It's not only problem solving. Problem solving is very important, but it's particularly important for certain jobs and not for other. A musician, for example, is not a problem solver or doesn't solve mathematical problems. So an intelligence is something more complex. I think, and a lot of studies would confirm this, the intellectual development, is linked to the frontal cortex and probably to the number of cells which are involved in that function. There are other people who have more numerous cells in other parts, but the ones who are able to connect more things, that is to say, the ability to develop creativity, the things or imagination that we were talking about. Well, it's a bit as if you were playing with two deck of cards. It's easier to have poker. You've suggested a question or brought a question that I hope will not take us on another path. Piero Angela is a very good jazz pianist and has always been playing the piano. He's always played the piano. And the feeling when we hear a music that we like is that our brain is working all together, that we're immersed in the music and that all our brain is active, but we don't know how. I can't explain it. It's something that I perceive in a rather confused manner. Now, this musical awareness, which is basically present in everyone. Some people have it more clearly, but other people don't, because they know how to play. Other people don't. But with a bit of musical education, we can all become listener. So, is music listening positive? Is it like a massage for the brain? Well, first of all, I must say that, as you said, music is learning. It too. If you take a person who has never heard a concert and you play a conference by Beethoven or Bach, they probably get bored, while they appreciate a simple song much more. there's so much more. We see it in jazz too, which is the field which I prefer from a pianist's point of view, especially in the past. There was a learning process which was necessary to reach a more advanced style of jazz. This is true for reading also. It's true for the people who get bored reading a book. But what about improvisation? Well, each one of us has an intellectual pleasure if the music is at their level of learning, or musical learning. So this too is important. The fact is that you don't teach music in schools. So here in Turin, I had tried to, with a foundation, to give musical instruments to schools, and Saturday afternoon and Sunday morning have instructors, teachers, and to allow the children to do what they wanted. For example, they could have had a band, the Mozart, jazz, alpine singing, anything. I was very surprised when many years ago I was in Miami for New Year, and there was the New Year's march, and there was the famous comedian Bob Hope who was leading the march, the New Year's Day march. And I believe about 60 bands and orchestras, 30, 40 people each, from schools. All of them with their uniforms, they were playing. This is not widespread in Italy. It existed with local bands in villages in Italy in the past, but it has disappeared. But if you produce music, if you paint, it's not only that you go and see an exhibition, but you paint, you understand from within, you want to improve. In particular, if you play with others, because there's emulation, there's the pleasure of being together, of doing something, of having a concert. All this leads you to then go and listen to a concert, because you can't take people and suddenly dump them in a concert by Beethoven, listening to music by Beethoven. It's like languages. You don't teach languages at school. Why? I studied French for 8 years. I went to Paris and I knew very little. I couldn't really speak. I had to learn the other languages on my own, learning them. That how you know here this very important thing, because you mentioned this Ministry of Education committee which involved me. I said, I don't know anything. Oh, please come as a... And I said, yes, of course, if my country calls, I will be there. But I did something very interesting, which is I suggested that in primary school to put a weighing scale, because you must learn that if you put one thing on one side, you must have put something on the other side, because we only measure advantages rather than disadvantages. Every time you have an advantage, what are you paying it with? Then you have to have multiple. If you have like a mobile, what happens over there if you've got to wait here? So to have a vision, a system vision, as happens with chess, which are fortunately not taught at school, and in this they too give an idea of planning and so on. Well, in this committee, one of the suggestions that I had made, and we're talking about the early 80s, was to teach English in primary schools. No, why not? Well, because it will affect the children's development. I think they will be affected if they don't learn English. In fact, learning 2 languages, it develops intelligence. Yes, develops other abilities. Well, you said we should learn. Somebody said Esperanto. Some will know there are not enough professors. Well, it doesn't matter. Start learning words, and then grammar will follow. So here there's also a problem of having new approaches, and I'm saying it, and I'm nearly 100. We would like to shed the old size. I will take advantage to give you a piece of news. There's a lot to be done in teaching. Everything's changed, but very little has changed in schools since when I went there. And I went to Turin because maybe you don't know, maybe you know. I am a Turin-born, Turin-raised. My family, both on my mother and my father's side, has been here at least till the since the 1600s. Well, I would also like to add that Piero Angela's father also had a very important role in the resistance and in saving Jews, because Piero Angela's father did some very important things. What I would like to give you as news, Pino Zappola said, there's also in the old main lecture hall, they're connected by streaming, so that means that all the people who were waiting outside in one way or another have been satisfied. Piero Angela, we spoke about intelligence. We only just touched upon creativity. But I would like to say, what do you feel when you improvise with jazz? Because that's creativity. Yes, there must be something I have to say that in jazz that is not always well perceived. I also studied classical music. I sat all my tests at the music school at the conservatory, but those who play classical music, we know it, is somebody who interprets, but they are not the creators of the music. They have a score and they follow it, and then they can put their personal touch to it, their personality, their ability to interpret, a sort of fettered creativity, yes. But in jazz, you're the composer. You're the person who composes the music. In that, you know that, as happened in the 1700s and the 1800s, but Mozart, but also Chopin, Beethoven, they sometimes improvised on themes that they're called variations. There was this pleasure, it's not really done, of improvising as well as composing, because they were great composers. So this is the need. You have a theme, but then you have to have variations. And you may be more or less successful, and that depends on your ability of the person who is composing in real time. So there's this pleasure of inventing, not only of executing. The word pleasure is very important. In inventing and creating, pleasure is very important. Yes, it's the basic. It's the foundation. You must do the things that you like to do, because it means not only that you are predisposed, but that you're involved and committed. There's a saying that says, do a job that you like, because you will not work for all your life. And this is not true for everyone, but those who are successful in doing this are very lucky. And I must say that I have been very lucky. I was able to do what I liked, and I continue to do it, in spite of the fact, can I say how old I am? No, better not. In spite of the fact, it's written in the encyclopedia. I should have been retired, but even we will get there. We still have a little time, and the last questions will be on aging. But I would like to now speak about creativity and intelligence in the brain, to talk about Albert Einstein's intelligence, because we're celebrating 100 years of general relativity, because we've recently been able to observe it directly, because, as you know, indirectly we were already able to see it. And on Einstein's brain there is a legend, because his brain was stolen in the anatomical hall, and it wasn't really stolen, but I'll talk about it. And then it was sliced. I would like you to talk about the history of that brain and what can we understand from slices of a brain, of Einstein's brain. Well, the story, which was recently discovered, is when he died in 1955, there was a center that had asked to be able to examine his brain. The executor, Einstein's executor, refused, but said that a pathologist could do it. Who belonged to the hospital where Einstein died, but he was not an expert. He was not a neurological expert, so he was not the best person or best suited person to do it. He did it. He took it. I think he did it in his office, put it in formaldehyde, and he sliced Einstein's brain in 240 cubes, as if it were a sort of stew, to study it in its various parts. He also sliced it. It's online, yes, and then he conserved it under formaldehyde, and very recently a journalist trying to find what happened to it. Oh, yes, he said, I've got it at home. And then it was given to a specialized institute. In fact, nothing emerged, because clearly it's not that you find in the genius in the brain. It's a brain like everybody else's. But they observed one thing, that is to say that it had a thicker corpus callosum. It's the part of the brain that divides the two hemispheres and connects it. It's a bit like a walnut, if you imagine it. They're the two sides and a connection. Well, there are hypotheses only, ideas. You know, you say, but it's true up to a certain point, that part of the brain, the left part, is more analytical, and the right part is more of a synthesis, and that this greater connection between analysis and synthesis favored Einstein. But we really don't know. It may be more fluid thinking. Well, I suggest that you study. I don't suggest that you study the slices, but I say that in the autumn, in November, in Turin, there will be an exhibition on relativity, on Einstein and Tullio Regge, who you will all remember who Tullio Regge was, and we will be looking into Einstein's brain, but not in that way through his discoveries and intuitions. And you're all invited to that initiative, which is being prepared here in Turin. I have another question which is more difficult than that of creativity intelligence. Are we free? Very rapidly, I'll be speaking about intelligence and creativity. My definition, my personal definition, well, first of all, I would like to say something. I'm sort of freewheeling here. In my book, I wrote things in a slightly more formalized and organized way, while here I'm just I'm trying to give you images. But I believe that intelligence is the ability to answer a question. And creativity is the ability to answer a question which has not yet been raised. This is what I defined. To invent the question. But there's an interesting thing. Many years ago, I had come across a psychologist in the US who was studying creativity. Well, first of all, he was saying one thing. We must distinguish between imagination and creativity, because imagination, to give a very simple example, is the fact that Leonardo da Vinci or Dante sit down and says, you know what, I'm now going to imagine the Divine Comedy. So I'll do this, that, and the other, but doesn't write it. Creativity is writing it. And creativity does not only require the ability and imagination, but also commitment, involvement. Michelangelo, when he did the Sistine Chapel, the imagination was, in fact, the minor part, because he had to work quarrel with the Pope, find the funding, being hanging on the ceiling for months. So creativity requires this, the ability to do, but to do with intelligence and imagination. We still have 10 minutes and questions for 3 hours. So I would like to ask you the question before. Are we free? We're intelligent, we're creative. Are we free? Wow, what a question. I can give you my answer. Everybody has their own. I'll give you mine. I don't expect anybody to agree with me necessarily, but we are deeply conditioned by the fact that we have a brain that was an evolutionary assembly line, like Fiat's. There's some people who can't sing and will never be able to sing. The people who can't paint, while there are others who are geniuses, who at 5, as Leonardo can draw. And others who know things of maths or can direct an orchestra. Every one of us, each one of us, has a talent, and precociousness is something else. It means you've got there earlier, but you don't necessarily continue. Genetic intelligence is the one which Mother Nature gives us, while acquired intelligence is what we get from nature. But intelligence, that is to say behavior, acquired behavior, is what the environment gives us. And therefore, this too is a very strong conditioning. I was mentioning about the wolf child. Well, he was unable to express his freedom because he was only able to be a wolf child. Likewise, people who have the ability to study also have the ability to process thought and to think they are free. But I'll give you an example. I would like to first quote something I sometimes put in my books, and apparently it's Voltaire, but some people say it isn't. But in any case, it could be Voltaire's. It suits him. I am free to want, to wish, to do what I want. But I am not free to want what I want, because this is the limit of individual freedom. Because you're strongly conditioned by your intelligence and your environment. And I'll give you an example. Imagine that instead of being born here in Turin and having studied philosophy or whatever, a great journalist and expert, he's an extraordinary person. I always quote him amongst the very few people I quote. He's very intelligent. No, there was a question. Yes, you're trying to avoid the question. I'll give you an example. One day he published a book a few years ago, and I said, because he was working at the Stampa, and he said, well, you didn't review it. And he said, yes, but I am proud that my newspaper did not review my book. It can be interpreted in 2 ways. Right. Let's go back to the question. So let's give an example. Instead of having had this life, you were born in a village in the Taliban area where there is the Council of Elders who decide to stone a woman and not to send little girls to school. And you would be probably there saying that. Would you not be there? Or do you imagine that in that Council of Elders you would say, no, Voltaire said this and that and the other? Yes, so what does culture make you free? Well, that's also culture. We're all conditioned by the environment, so there are many. Or is it tolerance that makes us free? Well, we're conditioned by the people who studied it, by the environment. We're not free at all. We are free. Well, if you want my definition of freedom, and then I'll try and give you another one too, is that freedom is the ability to be able to express freely your conditioning. This is very subtle. You're free. The Taliban, for example, says, this is what I must do. You think it differently, you must be free. It's something which, if they stopped you to do what you feel you should be doing, because they're part of your culture, your experience, of your personality, you would feel that you have been denied your freedom. But another person might have the exact opposite. But, if you wish, I'll give you a slightly less pessimistic or more optimistic definition. That is to say that we have two types of memory. Genetic memory, which gives us the structure, and the acquired memory, which gives us the environment and therefore environmental conditioning. But there is a third type of memory, which is the one which derives from your internal processing of information. When you think, and you start to think about things, and you start associating, and you start creating things, these in themselves form inner memories that are memories that you have created and that do not come from the outside, but from within. They come from your inside. So, in this way, at least partly, you can escape from the two memories that are a bit like stamped on you, and that is the space of freedom, of creativity in thought, which is where, in spite of the fact that you're using Lego bits from others, from nature and nurture, you build something different. That's it. I'm happy with that. And now, unfortunately, I must reach the last topic. We have to skip many. And the last topic, see us as experts with elder people, third, fourth, fifth age. What happens to the brain as it ages? The brain starts to lose neurons from birth. In fact, loses very many at birth and then slowly less. It's not true that you lose lots of things when you're older. Some, but we're not talking about disease because that's another area. So let's talk about being elderly but healthy and that you age in a normal manner. You certainly lose things, but you have such an abundance that this is not such a big problem. Rather than the number of neurons, it's the functioning of system that becomes less efficient. But there's something else, that every time that we learn something, it's as if we were a tree putting new leaves in Rome. There I have a wonderful oak tree. I don't know how old it is. In the winter it loses its leaves and then puts new leaves on, and every time there are some new branches and they continue to grow. And it's the same thing for us. We become old, we age, but we continue to enrich our brain. The ability of our memory to continue to feed into the nervous network is eternal. So what does this mean? It means that if you conserves throughout your life curiosity, the curiosity to learn, the pleasure to discover, well then, when you're older, you're still young, if you're healthy. I must say, very often, I say, my car has more than 80,000 kilometers, but the driver is always 45. That's what I say. My machine is old, but I'm a young driver. And it is the matter of organizing, because if I were a radio television employee, which I was very briefly, but I was never really there for long, I would have retired many years ago. What would I do if I'd retired? For the past 20 years, of retirement. What would I have done? And I always say it, and I'm talking about this for many years, because I've been telling people, you must prepare something for when you retire. We live longer. You can't take the dog for a walk and sit in the garden or administer a building for 20 years. Think, learn. We have a machine that's there to learn. I tell young people, prepare yourselves. You're going to be old. Because you have to start right from the beginning. You can't at a certain point change gears. The fact that you're curious, that you read, that you have contacts is very important. Music, invent, and then clearly work can also have some less interesting sides, but try to be interested in your work. There was a story which had really surprised me, because a famous economist had told me, and he said a journalist went to see some workers who were working in a quarry, and they were breaking off stones with a pickaxe or with. So the first one said, "What do you think of your work? Can't you see what disgusting it is all day here? And for the 4 pennies they give us." Then the second one, he said, "What do you think?" "Well," he said, "the work is not a lot, but it pays. But then I go home, got my hobbies, my wife's at home, so that's okay." And then he goes to the third one, and the third one says, "Shush, can't you see I'm building a cathedral?" So, beyond the metaphor, I believe that if you manage to be creative in your work, if you manage to add something of your own, it's not always possible, but I was really surprised, because very many years ago, the first time I went to London, there was a porter from a hotel who took my suitcase and said, "Sir," he was in a uniform, and it was a sort of, he was a character, and he was completely immersed in his role, a great dignity for his work. And to maintain the dignity of your work is very important, the respect for yourself, but also to add something into your work. Don't just say, "Well, if only it would finish," otherwise you'll suffer. Most of your life is there. You must try to adapt the work to yourself and not vice versa. You don't want the work to dominate you. This thing that you were saying, this anecdote from London and the porter, reminds me my Italian professor, whose name Enrico Andreoli. We went to the same school, the Liceo d'Azeglio, and Andreoli would say the difference is this between an Italian, say, and a British person, that the British person that says, "I am a porter," and the Italian says, "I do the job of a porter." We say we do the job of a journalist. We never fully identify with work, and therefore do not enjoy the pleasure of working, while the British do, and you can grow, increase the porter, because you can become a journalist from a porter or vice versa. Something which, when you were saying this, I lived in Paris, 9 years in Paris, and at a certain point at home, we got a gentleman who rang the door right at the beginning when we were in this apartment, who was the gas inspector. And I was usually used to seeing, and this one was a gentleman who was very distinguished. He took his hat off and said, "Je suis l'inspecteur du gaz." He wasn't working as, he was. "Je suis l'inspecteur du gaz." The subtitle here is "A Journey in the Mind." There are many of you, but you can sign a few copies, maybe outside. It says also how to get to know your brain, to keep it going, to keep it ticking. So in these few seconds that we still have, I would like to ask you, how do you keep your brain ticking? You've partly said so, because you've said maintain curiosity, be active, build interests, and so on and so forth. All these things certainly would work, but which contrast with the attitude of many people who would like to try and stop work as soon as possible. As a provocation, I would like to say, with all the problems which emerged, The Fornero law, that is to say the law on pensions, is not a law that has to do with social studies, but with health. There have been discoveries that every extra year you work, you live longer and live better. It's not a panacea against Alzheimer's, the fact that you continue to work forever, but certainly it helps. What we must do in a society is that this job, which is being done older, should not steal jobs to younger people. This is the first thing. And also they must be adequate, considering the age of the elderly people who are going to work. But the question I have to Piero Angela is this. First of all, work is apparently good for you. But there are are there any other secrets? Are there any other suggestions which one might give? Well, for those of you who are curious, in the last part of the book, there are a series of suggestions which concern all the development, because it's like an athlete. At 65, you can't start athletics or jogging if you haven't done it before then. If you want to maintain this type of activity, you have to have had a type of training. If you stop doing a job you know how to do, and you reach an area where you don't really know what to do, well, clearly, you must. When you're young, you must study how to become an elderly person. And then, as far as exercises are concerned, I was talking to someone earlier on, someone who is here from the adult education sector. That's very good, because it's a place where you find people, because that too is important. You mustn't be alone when you're older, because you lose your friends, unfortunately, your relatives, and you end up by being alone and dry up, while you must find a network of people who share the same interests, and this is very important. And then there are small things, exercise. I'm not only saying that you should do crossword puzzles. Yes, do the crossword puzzles, because this keeps you going. But also, some say, start writing with your left hand, because you will exercise your brain, or learn another language, or learn how to play an instrument. It's never too late to learn music. I remember that there was a friend of mine in Paris who had a neighbor who, I think she was an office worker and she was 60, and at that point she decided she would stop working and played the violin. And everybody was a bit worried about that. At a certain point, she decided to do something else which she knew how to do, or that she wanted to do. And so when you're older, you have to be alive, especially in our day and age. The average age when my father was born in Italy was 42. Now it's over 80. So it's more than doubled in a generation. We'll go on more and more. And there's another thing which is never said. A child that is born today, in 2100, will be younger than me. That is, and you youngsters who are now 18, 20, 22, you will live till 2080, 2090. So you will have a life which is you will have to learn a lot. So you'll have to have those cogs spinning, because the world is changing very rapidly. You have to you have to put your bets on your brain. You mustn't only study to get a degree and to pass the degree or to learn promotion or something. School is like a gym. But what life will ask you is to change jobs, to work on new opportunities. So also, prepare your old age like this. Those of you who will reach old age with a brain that is able to adapt, will succeed, because life is the history of adaptations, and we are the ones who are living many lives in a life. One example, my father was born in 1875. They hadn't even invented bicycles by then, and he saw the atomic bomb. My mother told me that in 1904, she was a youngster, she had seen in Turin the posters for the first attempts for flying that Mr. de Lagrange made, and it said, it was in a field, "Will de Lagrange fly or not fly?" And my mother saw men on the moon. So you will be seeing things that are as different and as extraordinary. There is an extraordinary acceleration underway. So the brain is the only thing that we can count on to have an awareness, and also to be able to jump on the passing trains. As you know, for the first time, talking about brains, the brain has a competitor, which is a machine. Recently, a few years ago, a famous book by two Harvard experts, economists and technologists, that was called The Race Against the Machine. And then they've written other books too, because what is happening, and we know it, and it has been said that there is a loss of work in many areas. There's an Oxford study that suggests that in 2050, when you will be 50-year-olds, half of the jobs that we now have will be carried out by machines. And so we have to govern machines or do things which are outside the circuit of the machine. Machines are like combined harvesters, cutting out all the jobs. So all the all the jobs that can be replaced by machines will be replaced by machines. You have to have creative jobs. I see it in my job too. Many youngsters write to me and send a CV, top marks, the first at university, fine, but this is only the basis, the foundation. If you have had good marks, you must then prove that you are able to interact, to communicate, to know how to understand what your job means, to suggest. And you must continue to learn. So what I advise young people to do is that because the world is extremely complex and competitive, you have to learn. At one time, if you were a mechanic, you died a mechanic. If you were a miller, you died a miller. But you have to do something different, flexibility and the ability to be creative as far as possible. So thank you very much to Piero Angela.